I've always found it interesting that in the late 60s and 70s, the Western faded in popularity, coinciding with the rise of science fiction as a broad popular genre, as though the final frontier were the West writ large across the sky. Gene Roddenberry pitched Star Trek as a wagon train to the stars as the crew ventures out into the final frontier. Lost in Space followed this concept more slavishly, if less seriously. Up through series like Star Wars and Firefly, the Western lives on in a lot of our popular science fiction, wearing a thin disguise of laser guns and spaceships. I think partly because they both speak to the same longing for wide-open, wild spaces that's deeply rooted in American culture in particular. Founded by pioneers in a difficult land full of dangers, it's part of our origin story, our self-image, and it carried through to some extent for most of our history as a nation. Of course, it's heavily mythologized. The Wild West was nowhere near as lawless as gunslinger movies imply, and the image of the rugged individualist homesteading the Great Plains largely ignores the role of the United States Army actively conducting suppression campaigns against the natives. But in the case of cultural impact, the myth is more important than history. In our myths, we're a frontier people. And we're all out of frontier. I'm talking about this here in Deadwood, South Dakota, which began as a rugged frontier town. You know, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, you're familiar with the whole story. HBO did a series loosely based on it. Today it's a tourist attraction full of hotels and casinos and several places you can get a good steak. Our frontier is full, even when it's unoccupied. Wherever you go, someone has already been. Someone owns the land. Manifest destiny has been fulfilled. We ran out of continent, and so our myths stop looking west and turn upward. And like the Old West, in our new stories, the final frontier isn't empty. We're not alone out there. There are people to trade with, people to fight. We tell the same stories in new settings. Sometimes we don't even bother replacing the Indians with aliens. We just plop the red man onto some new world where we can avoid the mistakes of the past.
I'm very sorry, but you will have to leave.
Telling ourselves that we've become better, more enlightened.
This is why you have come to us. To erase a stain of blood.
One of the curious aspects of this whole space western thing is how it initially tried to put some distance between its science fiction and its western aspects, but gradually came to embrace it and go out of its way to draw parallels both narratively and stylistically. Outland was a straight-up western story. There was a new sheriff on Io, but it didn't look like a western. Unlike Firefly, for example, which completely embraces that heritage. Even Han Solo in the original Star Wars, not only is the character following the archetype, but visually his costume has the same lines. The six-gun is swapped out for a greebled-up C-96, but it still rides in a stylized gunslinger belt at his hip, and he uses it to blast undesirable riffraff seen as less than human.
Sorry about the mess.
I first really noticed this in the 80s, when toy-line cartoons like Galaxy Rangers and the truly odd Marshall Bravestar appeared. But since then, the sci-fi western style has hung around through TV and film. Sci-fi games riff on this western element too. Borderlands and Outer Worlds dance across the screen like a bizarre, acid-fueled pseudo-memory of the western frontier. Most recently, Starfield goes that route, complete with cowboy hats and pseudo-six-shooters. The frontiers of space and the West are so interwoven that it turns up on a meta level. For example, the Expanse series, where Martians embrace the idea of the New West, sometimes complete with affected accents. It would be easy to dismiss all this as nostalgia, a national collective romanticizing of the good old days. But there's more to it than that. The underlying ideas speak to us. Good men standing up to evil, protecting the weak in a lawless world, building a life for themselves without having to answer to anyone. All of this manifests in our culture in other ways too, both good and bad. I think we can make a good case that it's tied to the entrepreneurial land of opportunity image, which both motivates people to build businesses, but is also sometimes inverted to blame poor people for their poverty as though it's a personal failing of some sort. We tend to see ourselves as the hero standing up to bullies. We kicked the British out, we freed the slaves, we whooped the Nazis. It doesn't matter that it's not quite how it really happened. History and cultural memory don't really talk much these days. And another way we can tell there's something more than just frontier nostalgia here. the peculiar interplay of cowboys and samurai. It's hardly esoteric knowledge that the Magnificent Seven and Seven Samurai are the same story. At some points, almost the same movie, shot for shot. The same holds true for Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars. It's significant that Kurosawa's films were made toward the end of the American occupation, a time when Japan had been upended and this young and vibrant outside influence was pressing in. And Japanese directors, inspired by American films, made samurai movies that inspired westerns. This cultural exchange goes on for decades, and after cross-pollination with anime, spawns a fully hybridized take with series like Trigun Stampede and perhaps the best example, Cowboy Bebop. I'm talking about the 1998 animated series, not the recent Netflix adaptation that I don't think it was as bad as a lot of people say, but it did miss the mark on a lot of points. Cowboy Bebop pulls from several influences, blending sci-fi, film noir, mob movies, samurai stories, and of course, westerns.
But you're lacking creativity in the cowboy character. He's lame.
Yeah, maybe that's the problem.
Perhaps if he was a samurai instead.
Now that I wouldn't question.
It really deserves its own standalone analysis, and I'll do one eventually after a careful rewatch with a notepad and some good scotch. Right now I'm looking at it as an artifact of this peculiar resonance of the Western and samurai genres, and more broadly the interconnectedness of modern American and Japanese popular culture. Cowboy Bebop shows us a remarkably familiar take on that final frontier, not only by confining it to the solar system, setting it on planets and moons that we can point to in the sky as real places, but capturing the feel of the Western frontier both stylistically and with that limit of the solar system, matching the old Western limit that while the frontier is big, it's finite, and the boundaries are known. Sometimes the choices are overt, such as the vaguely Mexican city in an asteroid in the first episode. But the entire series shows us worlds that are only decades old but seem run down and straining under generations of compromises and improvised repairs. On a conscious level, we kind of expect a brand new future to look brand new. Some fantasized, glittering and clean, idealized vision of Shanghai transplanted to Mars. But instead of a technological plug-and-play world, we get a gritty, dirty, field-expedient future that starts decaying the moment the first foundation is laid. It's all frontier towns, more Deadwood than Dubai. Even the big cities have this feeling of a short shelf life. It takes the romanticism of the frontier, that optimism that Star Trek borrows from the Western mythos and runs with, and crashes it into the fatalism of film noir detective stories. It's a vision of the future that we can all relate to because it's familiar. We're out in a new place, living in a cultural stew and turning to gadgets for whatever we need. But we're still lonely, angry, hashing over our mistakes and fighting over things that happened years before when we were different people. We went out into the frontier full of optimism, but the future we made didn't quite work out the way we thought it would, and now we've run out of wide open spaces. Whether we relate more to the cowboy who's seen his last cattle drive or the samurai watching the old world evaporate in the face of guns and steam engines, the sense of confusion and loss resonates. Perhaps the underlying element of the Western isn't just the West, or even the cultural self-image of the rugged individualist taming the wild frontier. The partial blending of the Western mythos with that of the samurai fits with a broader pattern of expansionism, not only in physical frontiers, but culturally. American culture, perhaps more than any other, has always been an amalgam, forged from disparate pieces hammered together by frontier hardships, trade, and war. An alloy of Anglo, French, and Spanish influences with native elements and later immigrant influences absorbed here and there. We intermingle languages, we erect monuments to tribal leaders and even defeated rebels. We take outside elements and make them our own. Is it really any wonder then that after a hard war with Japan and then a decade of occupation, we'd feel a certain affinity for their culture on a collective level? We could almost make a Western that has America and Japan as characters. Two men enter a frontier town. One, an old gunfighter, skilled and wise, but very set in his ways in a rapidly changing world. The other, a brash young man who thinks he can do anything. He's got money, and he's been lucky, but he attributes it all to his own skill. And they've staked out some of the same claims out there in the hills. Naturally, they come into conflict, and after a series of thwarted schemes, heists, and gun battles through the countryside, it comes down to a fight in the middle of town. That little old man is tough and fast. For a while, it looks like he might win this thing. But that young'un brought more than a 6-gun this time. That bomb blows out every window in town and sends the horses running for the hills in a panic. The old man gets knocked flat on his back. But the young cowboy has learned a lot over the course of their fighting. He extends a hand and helps the old man up. Yeah, he's a condescending prick about it, has to keep rubbing it in that he won. But he tends to his opponent's wounds and gets him back on his feet, even slips him a few dollars here and there. The two have a grudging respect for each other that turns into a sort of friendship. The old man learns how to adapt and thrive in the new world he once feared, and in turn he teaches the young man better ways of doing some things. And they walk off together to the next town and another story.